folks to do if they have questions, post them in the chat. I'll sort through those and prioritize them and aggregate them if necessary. And then we'll have Q&A after Brian's done with his remarks. I did post a link in the chat already to a location on the web where you can buy a copy of the book that this is based on and have access to some of the other information. So with that, let me turn it over to Brian.
Thank you very much, Stephen, and thanks so much to both ASU and the University of Texas for inviting me. I'm going to share my screen now. We'll get started. So just want to make sure, Steve, that's you can see this, yes?
Yep.
Okay. So the big question I think facing us today is this question of kind of whither the freeway. What do we make of it? What becomes of something that was really developed as a technology, was developed almost a century ago and still plays such an important role? So the freeway is the centerpiece of most metropolitan transportation systems in the US. If any city is sort of the low end of that, it's Phoenix. But this is something that distinguishes US cities from almost all others. And in some circles, the freeway today, especially the urban freeway, has become a mustache-twirling villain. It is something that is opposed, seen as a terrible mistake. And building or expanding metropolitan freeways seems to have fallen out of favor, at least in blue states and big cities, if not everywhere. And the question is, or not, if it's so unpopular now, you wouldn't know it by looking out at freeways most of the time. So while building or expanding metropolitan freeways may have fallen out of favor, driving on them has not. And in fact, freeways nationwide account for about 6% of all metropolitan lane mileage. They carry over a third of all metropolitan vehicle travel in the United States and almost half of all metropolitan vehicle travel in California. So they play an enormously important role in cities. Although in cities, urban planners and policymakers often pay scant attention to this technology. Between 1980 and 2015, metropolitan freeway travel increased 230%. When lane miles of freeways increased only modestly. So if anything, they're becoming overrun with cars with little hope of kind of what comes after. So the idea of the drive for dollars is really premised on this idea that there's been a lot of ink spilt on the metropolitan freeway era. There's been many books on the interstate system and how it came about, who the key figures were, the design and construction challenges of building freeways between and within cities, the political bargaining that went on, the decision to bring them into cities, and is there really anything more to say? And to answer that question, I'm gonna offer a short digression. So I was a planner analyst for the San Francisco Bay Area Metropolitan Transportation Commission in the 1980s. And I worked mostly on transit capital projects and operating subsidies in Alameda, Contra Costa, and Napa counties in the north and northeast part of the region. And in the course of this work, the words of one of my Berkeley engineering professors repeatedly came to mind. And he said, transportation systems are not planned and implemented, they're negotiated and financed. And I didn't really appreciate it until I went to the MTC. And this was hammered home for good when a few years into my time working at the commission, I read a newspaper, which is something that we used to do to get information rather than looking at our phones on the way to work, that a grand bargain had been struck to finance an extension of the Bay Area Rapid Transit System, or BART, into the San Francisco International Airport in San Mateo County. And this was interesting to me for several reasons. First, San Mateo County at the time was not part of BART. So this was quite an agreement to strike. The second is that none of the agency staff, of which I was one below the executive level, even knew that a deal was in the works to do this. And that the planning for the extension would commence after the financial deal was struck. So all of the public participation that went into developing this extension, which now operates to San Francisco Airport, came after the deal to finance it. And it struck me at the time that really finance was leading planning and that we don't pay enough attention to fiscal politics. So that's really what the Drive for Dollars is premised on. And in our book, my two colleagues and I try to excavate the role of fiscal politics in shaping transportation outcomes, how it's evolved over time, how it has influenced whether, where, when, and what kinds of roads are built, and in particular, how it influenced the evolution of freeway design and the decision to build them in cities. And that's really the story we try to tell. So Eric and Jeffrey are both former master's and then doctoral student advisees. Eric's now a full professor at Clemson University. Jeff is a full professor and associate dean at Florida State. And as we noted in the forward, the gestation of this book was about as long as it took to build the interstate highway system. So it certainly has been something we spent a long time on. So let me back up a little bit, and some of you may be a little shocked to see where I'm going to start, but it's an important story to tell that even the earliest road finance shaped the outcomes in terms of the network that was built and the way it was used. So through the late 1800s, most streets were unpaved, even in cities in the US. Street improvements were paid for by abutters, that is, the owners of property that abutted the roadway. Property owners would need to either do the work themselves or pay someone to do it, or agree to assessments to have the work done by a third party. This was considered fair as streets furnished property access, but it tended to discourage network improvements. The desire of many of those was to thwart through traffic. So if, for example, you were in a city, you made significant improvements to the roadway that passed your property, it might encourage passersby to use that route or that street rather than others, and you'd have lots of traffic. So in some cases, some improvements were made to keep the drainage away from the building, but the road would not be made attractive for travel because of a desire to discourage traffic. This system had strong free rider incentives. You hoped that neighbors did a good job so you didn't have to. And the result was poor quality roads and disconnected networks. And indeed, urban street networks were extremely disconnected, very uneven, made navigation difficult, and it made pathways very slow. So as grading and pavements and drainage improved, costs tended to rise, and cities and towns took over responsibility for street improvements and increasingly relied on special assessments and then property taxes to pay for them. This was commonplace by the 1920s, and property taxes, because cities were growing in the industrial area of the US, was a robust revenue generator. Property values were rising. And it was relatively easy to administer and difficult to evade because the property didn't move and we could determine whether people had paid their taxes. And it was roughly fair based on ability to pay and benefits received principles of taxation. By 1927, 82% of all local tax revenue was from the property tax. So that's the way that cities were raising monies of all kinds. And this assumed that the principal role of all non-tolled roads was property access, which would begin to prove problematic as cities grew and networks became more hierarchical. However, in the Great Depression, there was a collapse of property values and in turn, a collapse of property tax revenues. Between 1929 and 1936, assessments nationwide dropped nearly 20%. Revenues for streets dropped 83%. So what we're going to do to supplement the property tax? Traffic congestion, despite the rapid growth in the 20s and the relative decline in the 30s, continued to rise, and citizens were demanding new roads and more robust revenue sources. But what would it be? So now turning to the countryside, they had their own problems, and often there was a description about the desire that farmers were stuck in the mud and that something had to be done. So roads between cities in the US were rudimentary for most of American history and well into the last century. Road travel was vastly inferior to traveling by water and later rail. And the prevailing view at the time was that the federal government could not engage in road building. It was unconstitutional. It was not specifically something reserved for the federal government in the federal system, and therefore it was a responsibility of the states. So you had a similar model in the countryside where citizens were to require to form work gangs, and all citizens would have work road days or pay poll taxes to evade them. And there were lots of problems. Well, it was seen as egalitarian and equitable. All benefited from roads and all should contribute. As late as 1904, work requirements and poll taxes were about 60% of all rural road revenue. The abutter logic was even more problematic in rural areas than urban ones, right? Because the land on a farm may have lots of roadway passing by the farm, but it was relatively a small amount of traffic would be to that farm property. So there were work requirements, and there was lots of grumbling and evasion about that. People had hard lives, as it were, and to be able to have to take time off after the harvest to work on roads was something that many sought to avoid. There was low expertise and low motivation, and that led to poor work quality of roads. There was notorious exploitation of prisoners, and in the South, of Black residents, making them disproportionately responsible for road work. The turnpikes had proved to be money losers. There was experiment a lot during the 1830s and 40s with turnpike roads, toll roads. The property tax was inadequate in sparsely populated areas for so much road mileage. And in any event, the railroad controlled most of the longer distance travel. So against that backdrop, there was a goods roads movement from about 1880 on in the US. And it was started by cyclists, interesting, but it was soon taken up by drivers as cars came onto the scene between 1890 and 1910 or so. And there also emerged a profession of engineers and construction teams to take over as rural road improvement began. So outside of cities, the main thing was bonding issued by states beginning in 1894. It was considered effective under the political acceptability principle because deferring pain was always popular. We go into some explanation in the book that the road quality at the time was so low that the bonding period, often 20 or 30 years, was much longer than the life of the road. And it created a problem where there could be two sets of payments retiring the same debt on the same road. It really failed the revenue test. Rising road costs were surging with auto use, and indebtedness was increasing. Between 1952 and 15 and 22, debt rose from 7.1 billion to 1.9 billion in 23 dollars. So against this, the gas tax comes on the scene, and it was pioneered in Germany, Britain, and France in the 1910s. Oregon was the first adopter, but a cascade of states quickly followed. And by 1929, all states and the District of Columbia had introduced them. The gas step was a step forward under all criteria, and really it was the innovation of the gas tax that really brought about the modernization of road systems in the U.S. It had a good link between costs imposed and benefits received. Fuel use varies fairly closely with miles driven, and also with axle weights and heavier vehicles do most damage and would pay more. It was very easy to administer. It was levied on wholesalers and not at the pump. So evasion was difficult, and the cost of administration was only about 0.5% of all revenues collected. Very difficult to evade because, again, it was levied on wholesalers. And it was kind of a step forward under almost all public finance criteria. It fell early on disproportionately on wealthy motorists because they are the ones who were driving cars at the time, so ability to pay. And it proved a terrific revenue earner with all those new cars, fuel use was skyrocketing. And even after a brief hiccup during the Depression, VMT continued to grow. So what were some of the other advantages of the wonder tax? Well, it taxed out-of-state drivers, which is a real concern about people driving from other states and using roads without paying for them. It was largely hidden within the fuel price, again, levied at wholesalers and not retailers. It was paid pennies at a time, and we know from political fiscal politics that when you pay once a year, like with the income tax or property tax, you're much more aware of the tax. When you pay a sales tax or gas tax a few pennies at a time, it's less noticeable. It was introduced at a time when fuel prices were tending to fall, and so it was largely kind of lost within that. It proved very politically popular. Even after initial opposition, most of what would become the highway lobby eventually supported it. And that's an interesting story we tell, that what's known as the highway lobby today was sort of steadfastly against a lot of the road improvements that were proposed. So one of the other things was the way it was used that made it politically popular. And a key reason that eventually there was industry support was the linkage of fuel tax roads to road expenditures. Fuel tax revenues at the federal level and at most states go into special accounts that can only be used for transportation. They don't go into the general fund. At first, this was informal, and later, with auto interest lobbying, states began passing what so-called anti-diversion constitutional amendments, saying that you cannot move the funds out. Now, during this time, the prohibition against any federal highway spending had fallen, and the rationales were that the Constitution called for postal service delivery, facilitating interstate commerce and defense, all of which required some interstate movement, and therefore the argument or rationale went, there's a federal interest in roads. The Federal Highway Acts of 1916 and 1921 allocated billions in today's dollars and road construction, and started a very unusual thing. We go into this idea of matching, which if you're at a university transportation center, you know all about matching. There's a one-to-one federal match with states at this time, and the states were the leading partners. It was the states who built the roads, and the federal government sort of set standards for them. So eventually, in the 30s, came a federal gas tax. Washington had held off on implementing one, in part because it was seen as a state preserve of where they were getting money. But Franklin Delano Roosevelt had promised a balanced budget and wished to fund the New Deal to help the nation out of the Depression. And with the Depression hurting other revenue sources, there was gaping budget deficits, and came the federal gas tax. It was called a temporary tax. They were made very clear on the time. This was just during the Depression we would see that. And of course, we still have that temporary tax today. It provided robust revenue for the federal government. Again, even during the economic downturn, fuel consumption and travel after a dip started to increase again. And it would subsequently be renewed and renewed and renewed, with the rate hiked many times. The fuel tax money was diverted into job programs at first, which is interesting, as the federal government would admonish the states not to divert their fuel tax funds away from transportation. And yet early on, the federal fuel tax went into New Deal programs and not into a federal highway trust fund, which would come later. Meanwhile, on the other side of the ledger, what was all this money to be used for? There were nascent transportation planning engineering professions that were emerging in the first third of the last century. And they were struggling to cope with different sorts of transportation problems in the city and the countryside. Urban planners and rural engineers were each building toward a new kind of road that, from a distance, if you squinted, looked quite similar. But if you got up close, you'd see they were really quite different. These new roads would be enabled and, most importantly, shaped by the means of financing them. So what was to become of metropolitan freeways? One of the arguments we make is that the freeways we drive on today in metropolitan areas were very different than those envisioned by early transportation planners, while the freeways we drive in the countryside are quite similar to what were envisioned by early rural highway planners. And again, these urban highways are remarkably similar to the rural, what the rural engineers were planning. And why is that? Well, the story is money. So what were some of the objectives for early freeways in cities? Congestion was an enormous problem. Cities were being overrun by cars and trucks, and especially in central areas, so much so that it was really slowing commerce to a crawl and affecting the growth and economic development of cities. The idea was to disperse this new traffic over a wider area, improve commercial vehicle and especially public transit vehicle circulation. The planners at the time really saw these roadways as something that would help transit function more effectively by trying to move vehicles off of central city streets. Interesting as well is this idea that these new roadways would help preserve the viability of central business districts, which were starting to strangle on their own success with the growth of high-rise business centers. And suburbs were growing at the time, and the idea was to link established parts of central cities with expanding suburbs so there could be some connection between them. In comparison to the freeways we have in most cities today, the freeways envisioned were much smaller facilities with lower design speeds and simpler interchanges. And that's not because it didn't imagine larger facilities or higher design speeds or more complicated interchanges. It was because that was seen as appropriate for what was to go in cities. The freeways were configured in much denser networks that were closely tied to boulevards and arterials. So you can imagine these smaller roadways, there might have been similar levels of lane miles of traffic, but with much denser network of roadways, with something like 50-mile-an-hour design speeds rather than 70. They were often explicitly linked to adjacent land use. Sometimes there was plans for aerial development over the roadway as part of a way to finance them. Some of these were multimodal with separate facilities and rights of way and interchanges and stations for trucks, buses, and trains. Some of the bus only and truck only lanes that are contemplated or in place around the country would be very familiar in many of these plans. But there was lots of aspirations, but no money. Cities dependent on property taxes and special assessments just did not have the money to build these new and at the time comparatively modest roads. Unlike the 1930s, gas tax spending had been exclusively outside of cities. Not only did the cities not have access to gas tax revenues, but the states that were levying the gas tax revenues had prohibitions against spending money on roads in cities. They only were being spent on inner city. Cities were seen as having the means of paying for their own roads because they'd had the property tax spigot that had been generating lots of revenues until the Depression. But this was really unfair under either cost imposed or benefit received principles because urban motorists were contributing the lion's share of fuel tax revenues because the urban drivers were accounting for the lion's share of vehicle travel at the time. So cities broke out of money, strangling on cars and desirous to build new networks to try and move many of the cars onto them, began to eye the gas tax. The urban voters and drivers were demanding more roads. And cities began to develop elaborate plans for them, particularly with this newly developed freeway technology, again, a very different version than we see today. These plans were prepared mostly by urban planners. We go into some detail about the key figures. They often would, like carpetbaggers, go from city to city and develop plans for them. The plans tended to be more sensitive to local land uses, to demographics, to multimodalism. They tended to be more sensitive to the physical layout of the city as well, to try and be as least disruptive as possible. And again, the cities were reeling from this property tax collapse. There was simply no money to pay for these roads, no matter how elaborate these new plans were. The states and the federal government, however, had this mountainous fuel tax revenue, and there came the rub. So this just gives you a picture of what was going on. And this is funds available. The solid line is motor fuel and vehicle taxes, and the dashed line are property taxes between about 1920 and 1950. And you can see that the two essentially changed places over that time. As vehicle travel and fuel use was growing, as were the fuel tax revenues, and property tax revenues remained depressed well after the Depression. So there, we go into some details in the book, but eventually after some negotiation, there was a breakdown and state and federal funds began to pay for major urban roads. But with that shift in financing came a shift in control. The federal government and the states, that partnership that had been developed, they didn't just turn over the money to cities, counties. We didn't have metropolitan planning organizations back then. They really insisted that if we're going to spend this money, we're going to be responsible for building these new roadways. And so the power and control over these urban roadways shifted from cities and urban counties to states' departments of transportation, those people who were designing those rural freeways. So what were the objectives of the early plans for freeways outside of cities? Well, one thing was to facilitate farm-to-market travel. Railroads didn't do that so well, and the ability to get agricultural products into cities was really problematic with the rural road network there in terms of centerline miles was far greater than it is today. That was part of the problem. There was just too many dirt paths going up to farms, but no overall rural highway system. The goal was to increase intercity travel. Now, I want to point out that the goal was to manage cities that were overrun by cars in cities. Here, the thought was we could stimulate economic development by stimulating and promoting intercity travel. Part of that was also to compete with railroads that would engage in monopolistic pricing practices. Another was to improve rural highway safety, which was horrifically bad at the time. Vehicles were unsafe, and people would get up to high speeds in some cases and come flying into small towns and hamlets, and many horrific accidents and crashes occurred. Support intercity trucking as a viable alternative to railroads, stimulate economic development in depressed rural areas. So these were, for the most part, a very different set of criteria. We come to the late Depression era, just before the start of the US involvement in the Second World War, and Congress passed legislation that specified the Bureau of Public Roads, which would be the precursor of the Federal Highway Administration, to investigate, quote, the feasibility of building and cost of superhighways not exceeding 3 in number, running in the general direction from the eastern to the western portion of the United States, and not exceeding 3 in number, running in the general direction of the northern to the southern portion of the United States, including the feasibility of a toll system on such roads. This was encouraged by Roosevelt as well as a rural development plan. And really, what you can imagine were 3 east-west interstates and 3 north-south interstates. That's what they were asked to do. A year later, the Bureau of Public Roads came back with a really remarkable document called Toll Roads and Free Roads. And I'm going to highlight a few of their findings. One of them is that this 14,000-mile system of 6 transcontinental toll roads, 3 east-west, 3 north-south, just 1% of it was expected to be self-supporting with tolls. Over half of all the rural vehicle travel would be trips of less than 10 miles to or from cities. And part of that, remember, there was just no intercity travel because it was so hard to get from place to place. So one could make an argument that they have maybe underestimated the demand. But the thought is that there were such economies of scope and scale with railroads that they were going to continue to dominate intercity travel. And just over 1% of all trips were over 100 miles at the time. So the Bureau didn't stop there. They offered what Congress didn't ask for, what I called the bonus free roads portion of the report. And what they said was that, well, the light patronage forecasts and projected high cost of the toll system, in spite of that, they included this free road section of the report. In that section, they recommended the development of a considerably more ambitious 27,000-mile intercity network. So instead of 14, about twice as big, of grade-separated limited access freeways to be built to the same uniform standards proposed for the toll system. And here was the plan that was proposed for the free road section of the report. And if you look at that, it looks pretty similar to the interstate highway network we have today, although somewhat more sparse, right? Because this is 27,000 miles, and where we'll get to, it's going to be closer to about 46,000 miles. They concluded that the system must be comprised of freeways, which would reach into the central business districts of city in order to generate sufficient traffic to justify the investment of the scale proposed. And here I want to offer a second digression, and this is my favorite Peanuts cartoon. And in the first panel, Lucy, Charlie Brown's nemesis, is looking down at the sidewalk, and she says, well, look here, a big yellow butterfly. And she's still peering down, says, it's unusual to see one this time of year, unless, of course, he flew up from Brazil. I'll bet that's it. They do that sometimes. You know, they fly up from Brazil and her brother Linus interrupts. That's no butterfly, it's a potato chip. And to that, Lucy responds, well, I'll be, so it is. I wonder how a potato chip got here all the way from Brazil. Well, that's sort of the backward bending logic that toll roads and free roads have. And it went something like this. If we're going to attract toll-paying customers away from parallel routes, an interstate highway system must be built to very high standards to enable high speeds relative to the parallel options. Otherwise, people aren't going to be willing to pay the tolls. But even such a superhighway system, intercity travel demand projected it was not sufficient to finance construction and maintenance of toll revenues. Therefore, we must make the high standard, high speed national superhighway system free to be paid for by other means. But the new system won't have enough traffic, so we need to bring the new freeways into the heart of the biggest traffic generators, cities. So that logic is what got us to the point of building these rural highways, and we'll come back to that in a minute. After the war, there was an insatiable demand for highways. Road construction and maintenance had been put on hold in the war. In response to a housing shortage, suburbanization accelerates, rising prosperity and auto ownership in the post-war era. Vehicle travel tripled between 42 and 56. So enormous growth. And we began halting steps toward financing the interstates. Now, one of the things I'm not going into detail in here for lack of time is that the interstate program was actually adopted in 1944. So we often hear it was 1956. It was funded in 56. It was adopted in 44. And there was no question where it was needed. The plan had been adopted then, but mostly without funding. The question was, how should it be paid for? Unsurprisingly, everybody wanted the roads at the time, but everybody wanted someone else to pay for them. So most of the proposals were quite self-serving. There was a lot of opposition to interstate funding. In 1955, the interstate bill was finally put on the table to fund this program and to pay for what they thought would be a 13-year, $400 billion program in 2023 dollars. A 1-cent gas tax increase from 3 to 4 cents, which is a significant proportional increase. There'd be a dramatic increase in truck taxes, given research showing that trucks did disproportionate damage to roads. And it failed. And it failed because it was opposed by much of what would later come to be called the highway lobby, primarily petroleum industry, the auto industry, as well as most urban legislators who saw the interstates as largely a rural program. And again, in the book, we explain that early on, the planners of the 1944 Interstate Act said that they would leave the design of these roadways in cities to metropolitan and city planners because they had much more expertise on what form the road should take and what route they should take, and they should not be just run through willy-nilly. I go into some detail on that in the book, that they were quite deferential, that the standards and practices used for rural freeways made no sense in cities. Well, a year later, a new, very similar bill passes almost unanimously in the House and the Senate. And why the success now? President Eisenhower signed it in 1956. The success, we argue, was due to 3 innovations that were actually drawn from California. First was this idea of establishing a trust fund, which California had done in 1947, and it proved very popular. It was a firewall protecting the funds from general revenue expenditures, and it appealed to deficit hawks and auto industry interests alike. The second was that truck taxes were reduced compared to the original proposal. Now, this was unfair under the cost imposed principle, since trucks do most of the road damage, but a powerful lobby was mollified. And so here is the interstate system that was in what came to be known as the Yellow Book in 1955, something that was hastily put together with, you can see, an even more extensive system. I think this one is up to 41,000 miles. One thing is these lines were drawn to carefully go through almost every congressional district in the country. And number 3 was bringing the freeways into cities and being very explicit about it. This was to secure urban congressional support, and the urban routes were mapped out in great haste. And decades of careful plan in many cities were ignored. I show here on the left a plan from 1939 for Los Angeles. And if you see that, there are routes there where they're all called parkways at the time. They were not the parkways that we know today. You can see that some of them are empty, and you'll see others have dotted lines in them. That was the streetcars and the freeways. And in many of the freeways in the central city, the streetcars were to operate in the medians of the roadways. This is common in many plans around the country. They went off of those parkways and into underground tunnels in the central city. And so the transit and the highways were woven together. Here's the LA plan in the yellow book. You can see it's over a much larger area. And it almost looks like someone took a Sharpie and drew in the lines. These are very similar to what it was ultimately built, but done quite simply. But when that passed, things really changed. Remember that the interstate system was passed in 44, but by 1956, 12 years later, $89 million a year in nominal dollars were being spent. In other words, in 1956 dollars. After the passage of the funding of the Interstate Act, by 1966, 10 years later, $3 billion in nominal dollars were being spent. So a huge increase that led in a remarkable amount of construction. So the trust fund structure, remember that money's going into a trust fund, the money had to be spent. And so the planning and design was often done with haste. And I did interviews back in the 90s of many retired engineers, and they talked about they were worried politically about so much money piling up. And so some of the engineers I interviewed said, well, we learned a lot going along. If we'd moved a little more slowly, we could have saved money and kept from making some mistakes. Well, this will tell the story of why there was almost no transit integration in big cities, in part because, remember, a lot of these rural highway engineers were concerned that there simply wouldn't be enough traffic to justify these new facilities. That was a laughable proposition in cities, but they brought that thinking into their construction of urban highways. And there was a big push at the state level in many states against including transit in the highways for fear that they would take away too many customers from the roadway. It turned out that wasn't a problem. So the 9-to-1 match, remember I told you it was 1-to-1 in the past, it'd gone to 2-to-1 to get the cities and the states to build the interstates first. It went to a 9-to-1 match. It really became more of a co-payment than a match. It was an overwhelming incentive to focus on interstates. Excuse me. But it had the problem of discouraging the development of companion facilities and investments, so that it really became all freeways and not much else. So some of the other effects, well, most of the rural highway engineers in charge of state DOTs, the freeway designs began to evolve. They looked increasingly similar when they take over these plans to the intercity highways being designed in rural areas. They focused on moving as many cars the greatest distances with the highest speeds and safety as possible. There were wide, multiple lane roads. The networks became less dense. There were much more widely spaced interchanges. Many of the early plans had many more simple interchanges. These were more widely spaced and more elaborate interchanges. Much larger footprints than were being planned, sweeping curves for 70-mile-an-hour design speeds, and so on. And that actually required that a lot more land had to be taken. More people had to be displaced to fit these new, much bigger, much faster, much wider roadways. There was more invasive and less content-sensitive shoehorning of roads into cities. And really, these were rural highway solutions applied to urban problems. So what happened as we started to develop them? Well, typically low-hanging fruit was picked first. So in urban and suburban areas, that meant the easiest and cheapest routes were built first. That was undeveloped land in the suburbs. I grew up a couple of 100 yards from a major interstate highway. I would ride my Stingray over and watch them build it. The homes had been built right up to the edge of it, but none had been displaced because the land had been set aside. In urban areas, it was waterfronts, railroad lines, and parks, and often poor and Black areas. They were less expensive financially and less difficult politically to clear and build. So one thing we note is research shows that the initial Yellow Book plan for urban areas did not disproportionately cite freeways in Black or Latino neighborhoods. And in fact, in poor neighborhoods, because it was really drawn as a network. But over time, the highways migrated to these two types of areas because white and more affluent areas had more political clout to push back on unpopular routes. And it was cheaper to buy the land and condemn it in lower income areas. So that in practice over time, there became more and more income and race bias in the construction of the freeways. And also it was urban planners and not rural highway engineers who saw freeways as tools of what was known at the time as slum clearance. So there was a spectacular rise and fall of the freeway era. Well, that would make sense if the whole system was built out. And indeed, most of the rural system was built out, but very large shares of urban highway plans never came to fruition. Here's more detailed data that we put together for California. I just want to show you some of the things that were going on. So Ronald Reagan, a decidedly pro-freeway governor, became governor in 1966, and that was the peak year of freeway development. And he presided over a decline in freeway construction in the next several years. You can see as routes opened, it was a little more stochastic. In 1973, the LA Times proclaimed that the freeway program was dying. In 1974, multimodal Jerry Brown became governor the first time and announced that they were going to turn in a different direction. You can see that curve was going down. And in 1983, pro-freeway Governor Deukmejian was elected, and yet freeway development was at a much lower level. And that was really that money had run dry, and many of the urban routes had been abandoned. So what ended the freeway era? The typical story is that in the late 60s and early 70s, freeway revolts had played the biggest role. And we agreed that they had something to do with it. But again, we argued that the key was finance. If we look at highway construction costs and inflation, here is from 1950 to 90, highway construction costs were typically running ahead, in part because urban land was growing in value and right-of-way acquisition was difficult. The other is that as time passed, we were designing more and more elaborate freeways, more weaving sections, more elaborate interchanges, more buffers and sound walls. As time went by, they became just bigger and more elaborate facilities. Here's what was going on with fuel tax revenue at the same time. So as you can see, there was a big divergence between how much revenue was coming in and what was going on in terms of costs. So the pot was getting, in relative terms, smaller and smaller relative to the cost of completing the system. And more freeways were dropped off, even when there was no popular or political resistance to the routes. Here's a couple of things I could explain to you later why we had to do it this way, but there were changes in the way they calculated things. But if you look between 1960 and 1970, this is inflation-adjusted capital expenditures per mile of completed freeway. So the costs of freeways after controlling for inflation doubled between 60 and 70. And then between 80 and 90, they doubled again. So the costs of freeways were going way up at a very high rate, and revenues were not following. On top of that, I'm not going to go into all the details of what was behind it, but you can see here that with the fuel embargoes and new CAFE standards that came about, that we started to have a divergence between motor fuel consumption and vehicle miles traveled. This is great for efficiency. It's terrific for the environment. But if you're reliant on fuel tax revenues, it means that the use of roads is getting out in front of the funds that you're collecting for them, unless fuel taxes rise on a regular basis, the levies. We put this together in the book. This shows essentially, on the left bar is the nominal fuel tax in 2019. And then it shows what the fuel tax would be. The dark level is the average, the federal fuel tax. The lighter shading is the average state fuel tax. what it would be in 2010, in 2000, 1990, 1980. And what you can see is that the fuel tax in relative terms was vastly higher in 1960 and 1970 than since then. Some would argue that makes sense, right? We largely built the interstate highway system, but it meant that funds for expenditures in urban areas went way down from fuel taxes and have remained low today. So as planned routes were abandoned, what we tended to do was cram more and more capacity onto existing routes. We'd widen lanes, we'd take a little more land, add more elaborate flyovers and interchanges, start to put in HOV lanes and HOT lanes, putting more and more on. So what happens is we have the urban freeways we have are bigger and bigger traffic generators, pollution generators, and dump more and more traffic onto urban streets at very limited points that create localized congestion. Here's a look at, and we tell the story of the 105 freeway, one of the last urban freeways built, and the 110 freeway, an early one in Los Angeles. And you can see this is a freeway that has center lanes for HOT, for high occupancy toll, center lanes for urban busways. It has flyovers, and it has separate flyovers for the HOV lanes. So enormously space consumptive in the amount of land taken for this freeway. And of course, that pushed the per mile costs up even higher. And finally, we're at a movement now. This shows part of the waterfront in San Francisco. When I lived in San Francisco, there was a double-deck freeway on the roadway right in front of you, proceeding up toward Fisherman's Wharf that wrapped around, eventually dropped down as it went through Fisherman's Wharf, that was intended to go all the way to the Golden Gate Bridge. After many years, that was taken down and replaced with a surface roadway. And there has been a nascent freeway reduction movement, but that's been on relatively few routes. So the more things change, we're seemingly always in an era where transportation funding is considered inadequate to meet system highway maintenance and reconstruction needs, to accommodate rising demand, to shift for expenditures, for example, on bikeways and more pedestrian infrastructure to improve public transit. It turns out that the fuel tax is one giant Achilles heel, and that is it does not track inflation. And it's not the rise of electric vehicles, although that may come. It's really that as costs goes up and as fuel efficiency increases, a per gallon levy has to be raised on a regular basis to keep track in terms of how much revenue it generates. Well, that's a political Achilles heel, because the symbolic effort of raising that levy over and over again on repeated times conveys to voters and by elected officials a bit wary of taxes that you're simply raising it more and more and getting more and more revenue, even though what it is that inflation and fuel efficiency combine to erode the fuel tax. Things like income taxes have the opposite effect, is that people move into higher tax brackets with inflation. So the search is for a revenue source that's fair under costs imposed, benefits received, ability to pay, it's politically acceptable, it's logistically achievable, it's robust in revenue generation. It shapes travel behavior in desirable ways. Is it going to be just to increase the gas tax? Are we going to go to tolls and road user charges, just flat VMT fees? Are we going to do just more borrowing, which we've been doing at the federal level in some states? Move toward more public-private partnerships, increasingly depend on local consumption taxes like local option sales taxes. We're going to just have general revenue transfers. The search is still on. As we say, we're auditioning many of these, but no one has yet taken a leading role. But I would argue that we're still largely ignoring how the politics of transportation finance importantly shapes when and where transportation infrastructure gets built, the form that infrastructure takes, and how people and firms make travel decisions. That the way we collect money affects travel behavior in ways that are often ignored. Thank you very much. I appreciate this. I want to note that the book is available from Amazon and other fine booksellers on audio, Kindle, hardback and paperback forms, and I appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Excellent. It was one of those that it was fun to watch the rerun. in my case. So I continued to learn more. A couple things. If folks haven't yet, do put some questions in the chat. We've only got a couple, but I want to focus on one of them first. Chad Bailey has a lengthy comment and question, and I won't read the full comment. It's in the chat for folks, but he said here, I think is the essence of it. As far as the economic development that was sought, and this is in the context of urban freeways, was slum clearance considered as meeting that kind of goal, or was highway alignment and construction just a pretext for that kind of policy? And let me address that a little bit, because obviously in this era with a much heightened sensitivity to equity, we're all of a sudden, meaning the last few years, hearing an awful lot more about kind of the history and the consequences of the freeway system. And as you did your research and uncovered the history, how explicit or implicit was the issues associated with the racial and economic influences and biases in the decision making, the alignment decisions, etc.? What kind of insight did you get from what was available, at least as it was documented?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I did kind of skip over that real fast in the interest of time. We looked at a lot of the urban plans developed in cities around the country, St. Louis, Tampa, all over the country. And I think that I probably went into this really with kind of the insensitive highway engineer being sort of ignorant to what kind of a consequence an urban freeway would have on cities. But there is definitely overt and covert kind of racial coding that went on in a lot of the urban plans. There was a belief in this idea that somehow poverty was caused by blight, and there was a desire to use this freeway development as a way to clear out blighted neighborhoods. And there was a lot of coded language, but it was often very clearly pointed at poor non-white neighborhoods frequently. That it was really the urban planners that saw this, as we point out, was called and criticized by people like Baldwin, that urban renewal was Negro removal, and that this existed in many of the plans, and a few of those who were behind that. So a very important a designer and engineer, Harlan Bartholomew, had a very big influence on urban planning in the field. Often it had very explicit discussions about the need to sort of clear out these poor and Black neighborhoods and replace them with other kinds of public development. Now, that's where I tried to raise that point. What was interesting is that the network folks really were trying to say, how do you distribute traffic around the metro area? And a network requires to go through all kinds of neighborhoods, right? So there is a bias in there's some great research done by, I've forgotten their names now, we quote them in there, where they looked at kind of what happened over time. And as I mentioned, that these routes would often migrate out of some areas. And really it was both to parks and waterfronts, but also poor Black Latino neighborhoods that the freeways would migrate to. And again, I think that later that was often because of just the enormous differential power between Black and white political structures in cities. But there was definitely in the plans, and these were not so much in the plans that we saw for state highways, because definitely those issues didn't really come up as much. But there was definitely racial animus, racial bias, and some outright racism in the plans for many cities. So it's this, we try to tell this more a nuanced story about kind of how those things came together and played out.
If you have to look across the spectrum of actors, from the pure political folks to the urban planner folks to the engineer folks, is there any kind of sense of who was driving? You talk about money driving the location decisions. Are you seeing any sense of, which stakeholders were in effect in retrospect to blame, or to credit with attributes of the design, as it were?
Well, I think that if I understand the question correctly, we argue that kind of as time went on, a few things happened. One is that money was running short. There's a lot of attention paid to unpopular routes, and those were usually organized by more affluent and kind of nascent environmental organizations, things like that. There were lots of planned routes that simply didn't get built. And what happened at some point is that with money running dry, where was the cheapest route that you could actually get something built? And it was often through the waterfront, through the park, or through the lower income neighborhood that it would get built. So you can think of that as having an implicit racist effect, where some of the early plans were more explicit in the idea of trying to remove certain kinds of neighborhoods. But I think as well is that when it became just too difficult, politically too expensive to purchase right of way, I didn't have time to go into this in the talk. One of the things that happened is that as money was running short, money for advanced right of way acquisition was the first to go. That was the first thing that was cut. And yet a lot of the early highway planners were saying that had to be the first expenditure, because the production of the freeways themselves, especially in suburban areas, greatly increased the value of the land in those suburban areas. And it did. And because of that, there was money to be made. So when the plans were drawn, speculators would start buying farms and other lands around these suburban freeways and realize significant gains. When it came time later to purchase the land, higher prices were being paid in part by the appreciation anticipated by the freeway construction. So in many ways, the advanced plans were sowing the seeds of their fiscal demise, right? By making the land more valuable out in suburban areas. So what would happen is the networks became much sparser. And as a result, there was the freeways became bigger in terms of the capacity, more lane miles per centerline mile, and trying to squeeze more and more capacity onto the limited. So again, we argue it was the fiscal circumstances and politics that were shaping the sort of giant urban freeways we see today. And that if we had those much less dense, or much more dense networks of smaller scale facilities, they would likely be viewed very differently today than the behemoths are that we see in many cities.
I can't agree with you more on that. Let me touch on what I think is a key question in terms of where we're at today. You mentioned California being credited with some innovations that made the trust fund work in the past. Do you have some more tricks up your sleeve when you think ahead to where we're at right now with a trust fund that's only covering about half of the expenditure levels for the transportation system, and some real risk? We got through COVID, and with the emergency enabled us to do advanced funding and get us through this authorization cycle at the federal level. But as we go into the next authorization cycle a couple years out, we're looking at what would need to be virtually a doubling or more of the gas tax at the federal level, plus a ramping up to cover inflation and increased electrification that would continue to whittle it down. What do you see happening? And also, as we do this, we're now at a point where arguably our sensitivity to general fund transfers to the trust fund might be more difficult in light of the level of the deficit. So what's your thinking about where we're at right now and what the quote financing might mean to the future of all transportation? Because obviously the trust fund pays for more than just the highway system.
Yeah, when the infrastructure bill was first proposed, one of my co-authors, Eric Morris, and I wrote an op-ed arguing that the Biden administration was pushing to climate and GHG reduction goals and pushing for infrastructure development. And there was no mechanism that was better accomplishing both of those things than a fuel tax. And that in real dollar terms, the federal fuel tax, has been declining for 30 years. And that a great way to fund it is that the fuel tax is still generating lots of revenues in states. It's interesting that many states have gone different directions. California has raised its fuel taxes quite a bit in 2017. Pennsylvania has done quite a bit. They don't necessarily follow blue state, red state, but there's huge variation. Some states over the last 10 or 15 years have lowered fuel taxes, others have increased them quite a bit. But the fuel tax is still a pretty good money generator. And if it does, it helps to encourage people to have more fuel efficient vehicles. It strikes me that political liability, which is to say, oh, well, it's so far behind now, it had to be a huge increase, that the only way to do it is to say we're going to do an annual adjustment of a few cents a year. But that can add up to enormous amounts of money. And politically right now for the federal government, that's the way to go. The two options that are emerging is a road user charge, and the road user charge politically is being pushed toward a flat per mile fee. That's not guaranteed, but a flat per mile fee actually does less on the sort of externality side than the fuel tax. The fuel tax taxes burning fuel. And if you can get further burning less fuel, you have more efficiency, you produce fewer criteria pollutants, less GHGs, it has that built-in benefit of generating revenues. And typically, if it is sort of a sin tax as it goes up, it gradually will help to with a transition, generating revenue along the way. We're going in the other direction with a road user charge. It's a flat per mile fee, and may not account for vehicle axle loads, which anyone who does pavement work knows has a huge effect on the costs incurred by the road system. The other thing that we're, I would say, unfortunately, I'm working on a book with my, well, it was being led by my former colleague, Martin Wax, and Mike Manville and I, looking at the rise of local option sales taxes for transportation. Those have proved very popular politically. They're enacted usually at the county or the metropolitan level. It's usually a half-cent increase in the sales tax. When asked whether, in all sorts of focus groups, whether people would prefer a half-cent increase in the sales tax versus an nickel increase in the gas tax, they'll almost always say, I prefer the half-cent increase in the sales tax. They say, why? And the follow-up is because a half-cent's less than a nickel. And when given the follow-up, did you know that the average household would spend more than a half-cent increase in the gas tax, fuel tax, or sales tax, than a nickel increase in the gas tax? Voters will change their mind, but you can't go through each voter like that. And so that is moving to a general consumption tax that has nothing to do with the road use, and is income regressive to boot. So the two things being auditioned in many ways lack many of the merits of the current fuel tax in terms of being fair. You drive more, you pay more. You drive a heavier vehicle, you pay more. And right now, I would say that the sort of the simple RUCs, road user charges, and the sales taxes, in many ways, are moving things away from the federal level to the local level, and moving things away from actually paying for driving to essentially having it be a general consumption tax of some sort.
As you think about the path forward, I've been watching the perspectives of the political candidates, and obviously Biden was willing to dip into the strategic reserves to soften the impact of high fuel prices. Our governor in Florida, DeSantis, rolled back the state gas taxes, did numerous other areas. As I recall, Nikki Haley proposed moving away from the Highway Trust Fund completely. And yet at the state level, I believe it's well over half of states have been willing and able to increase their user fees, gas taxes, a number of them adding surcharges for electric vehicles, without any necessarily huge political pushback or consequences. So there's something of a disconnect there in terms of willingness to to exercise the user fee and the behavioral aspect of having user pay and walking away from the user pay kind of concept. Do you think that, I mean, when you think of it in the context of implications for transportation going forward, if we move away from a user fee based concept, do you see that changing the level of funding, the modal mix, the geographic mix, anything like that? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, if we really think about what the whole federal program did from about 1916 to 1956, over that 40-year period, is that the transportation engineering was really in its infancy, and there was just terrible construction, terrible drainage of roads, very poor quality pavements, lots of safety issues, and that a lot of times what the federal matching funds were doing was professionalizing the whole industry, creating standards and practices, creating sort of uniform design standards, moving best practices forward, and professionalizing things from what was sort of a reluctant volunteer model to something that was done professionally. That role has been accomplished. So it's not so clear now that when a region passes a sales tax and builds a highway or a new rail line, that lack of professionalism is the issue in terms of what is being put together. And remember, I was telling you that at first the thought is that transportation was largely a local concern. Arguably, the interstate commerce part, managing goods movement, is the federal role is very clear there. It's certainly more obvious in terms of being a federal role than, say, public transit in a large city. And yet there's really a relatively smaller footprint in terms of managing goods movement at the federal level. I mean, there's efforts in that regard. So the question, and we wrestled this a little bit at the end of the book, is sort of we moved from entirely local, really a property abutting a roadway. That's where we started with road finance, and we ended up with a federal and state partnership that built an interstate highway system. We, with ICE-T, we moved more to metropolitan planning, and the share of revenue, if you looked at that graph I showed, the state fuel taxes have been rising when the federal has not. There's a rise in more sales taxes and other kinds of revenues for transportation. An argument that may say, well, allow metropolitan areas to, if some want to do things based more on roadway development and others want to emphasize active transportation and transit, so be it. Allow them to innovate and take more responsibility for funding. That's kind of where we're headed. The federal role, early in my career, what happened with the next authorization really was the thing that was driving all policy talk at the state level. And that's not so much. I mean, the Infrastructure Act has had a big effect, but it's not part of any kind of regular kind of policy setting or authorization process. So there probably maybe other people on here that know more about, and you, Steve, in particular, about kind of the federal politics or not. But I think that the feds pushed all sorts of things, but it's when they had that money that they were able to influence outcomes greatly. And if they really want to influence outcomes again, it's coming up with a way of gathering money for some means other than taking on debt for them to do that. And without that, maybe you've got enough built and making expenditures on infrastructure part and parcel of budgetary debates is where we're headed. But there's an argument that management of that infrastructure really calls for regular funding that isn't left to the whims of Congress every couple of years. But we're certainly headed in that direction.
Yeah. Let me throw out one last question here, and I'll paraphrase it a little bit. It's how do we get non-rural highway planners or context-sensitive highway planning? And I think he was alluding to the fact that you said an awful lot of the urban system was really, in effect, driven by the design standards and culture of the rural planners. And in a more general sense, and your last discussion kind of alluded to this, but are we past that where the profession is sufficiently sensitive and sophisticated that we're not going to be boxed in by those kinds of situations going forward?
Well, there is, I think there's things going in both directions. One is, one of the bigger effect and one of the biggest fights was, if you looked at a lot of the early plans, and many of them had, there was lots of crossings, for example. The idea was not to try and disrupt the movement of people and goods and traffic on the surface street system as much as possible. So there were sunken highways with lots of streets crossing over. There was a lot of resistance to that because it raised costs when those freeways were brought into cities, and so you'll have fewer crossings in rural areas. Increasing the crossings has often been allowing animals to migrate, and in cities, there's a movement toward trying to put in more crossings to allow more humans to migrate back and forth underneath these freeways rather than being pulled into major underpasses and interchanges. That could be an example of trying to, that sound walls, I think, are a way that we're trying to kind of soften the effects on the other hand, really the only place you can really add road capacity is more weaving sections and things like that. So you kind of sneak miles in by dealing with making interchanges larger, squeezing freeways a bit larger because it's difficult to add capacity elsewhere. And so we're going in the other direction of making them more behemoth structures that really have negative effects on people living and playing around them. And I think that we need to also take in mind, and I'm trying to think about, I was just in Texas recently, and I always pay attention to this, that when I'm approaching cities and we've built single family housing right up to the edge of the freeway and schools along the freeway. These cannot be pointed at the freeway designers. This is failures of local land use planning. A lot of commercial and industrial activities love to be adjacent to freeways, and yet we consistently zone lots of residential and other kinds of recreational space and outdoor space around freeways where plumes of fine particulate matter really disperse over a couple of 100 meters quite dramatically. We know these increase the public health consequences of highways. There are ways we could address that through land use planning, and yet we often fail to do that. So I think that there are things that that we have the ability to do for better or worse, we're stuck with these big facilities. We keep making them bigger. We can probably do more to try and ameliorate their effects.
Well, thank you.
Finally, last thing I want to mention is I had a quote from David Jones. He said that one things that freeways did is they segregated cars from people quite a bit. We probably wouldn't have as much driving per person if we had never built freeways, but we would likely have a lot more surface road traffic than we have now. And one question is to whether that would be a better outcome. And really, I think that in many ways, not the slum clearance part, but the designs themselves probably were a better way to manage traffic in cities than what we have.
Well, thank you very much for your time and your effort on this initiative. We really appreciate it. Like I said, this will be posted so folks that have listened and want to share it with colleagues and friends, have at it. There is a link to the book in the chat as well. So thanks everybody for participating this afternoon. Appreciate your time and attention.
Can I make one request? I see a lot of comments in there that might disappear. Those of you who have written a comment that we didn't get a chance, if you want to just send me an email at btaylor@ucla.edu.
I already saved it and will share it with you.
Okay, perfect. I'd love to see those. I may not be quick, but I will eventually get back to all of you.
Thank you
very
much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Steve.